Welcome. Welcome everybody to our afternoon session. Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Sta, Slandak Nelchina. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna, a citizen of the native village of Kludika along the Copper River in Alaska. I'm from the Paint Clan and my dad is of the Down from the Sky Clan. My mother and maternal grandparents are of Sicilian descent. I am an assistant professor of public health and the associate director for the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona and a member of the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, a dry lab group that I lead, which focuses on research, policy, and practice for Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm active domestically in the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and I'm chair of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Tana O'odham Nation on whose unceded lands I sit today in Tucson, Arizona, as well as the Pasquayaqui tribe, whose people also share these lands. I also acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and their lands on which you all sit, recognizing that the work for which you gather here today emerges from a commitment from each one of us to the responsibilities we hold at the intersection of COVID-19 and climate. On behalf of the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, the Southwest Climate Adaptation Center, CLIMAS, the Climate Assessment for the Southwest, and the Indigenous Foods Knowledges Network, with funding from the Intertribal Council of Arizona and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I welcome you to the Data and Research Priorities for Southwest Climate Travel Resilience Summit. Althea Walker will host this afternoon's roundtable discussion with Dr. Kerry Joseph, Dr. Franklin Sage, and Phoebe Swinia, who will explore intersections of tribal data and research governance and climate and resilience in the COVID-19 era within an applied community setting. This afternoon, Althea will host the roundtable, and both this roundtable and this morning's discussion will be available on the Summit website on indigenousdatalab.org. Althea Walker is currently the Tribal Climate Science Liaison for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. She is a descendant of the Nez Perce, Hopi, and Gila River people and is an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community. Althea is a certified public manager and a leadership in energy and environmental design lead green associate. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Resource Management and Master of Science in Environmental Technology Management from Arizona State University. Dr. Kerry Joseph is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Center for Indigenous and Environmental Health Research at the University of Arizona. She specializes in chemical and biophysical relationships between natural and engineered landscapes impacted by hazardous waste and human disturbance. Her interdisciplinary efforts also include climate change impacts, human exposures to anthropogenic contaminants, and water resource management and policy in Indigenous populations. Using a holistic lens, Dr. Joseph's work informs decision-making in science and policy to advance social equity and data sovereignty efforts for marginalized populations. She is a citizen of the Hopi Nation where she was born and raised. She is of the Coyote Clan and a child of the Snow Clan from the village of Munkapee. And Dr. Franklin Sage is the director of the Dene Policy Institute. He's a graduate of the University of North Dakota with a BA and MA in sociology and a PhD in educational foundations and research. He is a co-author for publication in the project International Review of Qualitative Research, and the title of the article is Decolonizing Our Own Stories, a project of the Student Storytellers Indigenizing the Academy group. Dr. Sage has also co-authored with Dene Policy Institute staff and interns in the Tribal College Journal, and as well as in several other publications. Dr. Sage has served 12 years with the U.S. Army and is a combat veteran of Operation Iraq Freedom. He is from Counselor, New Mexico. And finally, I'm happy to welcome Phoebe Swinia, who helps Native communities and local municipalities address environmental natural hazards and water resource issues by utilizing a consensus-based approach that incorporates traditional local knowledge with science-based planning, engineering, and project management solutions. A member of San Felipe and Cochiti Pueblos, Ms. Suinia's core values and teachings come from Pueblo perspectives on how to steward and manage the land and natural resources for the health and well-being of the community. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to our roundtable participants for agreeing to share their perspectives today. On to you, Althea.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you to everybody who has joined us today, sharing your time with us. And thank you to our panelists who have committed their time to planning and participating in this panel and sharing your knowledge and experience with the rest of us. Before we start, I just want to let you know how things will go from here. I have some panel questions for the panelists. Each of the panelists will have an opportunity to respond. After that, if anybody from the audience has a question, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. And then we'll move on to the next question, in which we have 3 for our panelists today. If you have questions as we go through, and you didn't have time, and we didn't have time to ask or get responses for it, please put it in the chat box, and we will have a time at the end of the session for an open discussion and Q&A. So before we get into the panel questions, we wanted to reflect, and if you can pause it on that slide, Andrew, we wanted to take the time to reflect on an interactive activity we did with this morning session and asking the audience how COVID-19 is impacting their communities. And they shared 1 to 2 words with us to express that. And so we just wanted to put that on the screen and just take a moment to reflect on what was shared, whether it's emotions, work-related, things that are most important to them, whether that's health, food. So some of the bigger words the bigger words are the words that were shared the most. So health, hopeful, long, water, mental, emotional, which I'm sure we can all relate to in some sort of way. And we also wanted to give the opportunity to this afternoon panel to share your thoughts and reflections, but to a different question. And that question we have for you today is, what has COVID-19 made apparent as related to the climate crisis? And Andrew will pull up Poll Everywhere for us. And you will be able to put your responses into the Poll Everywhere in a live, it'll be shown live up on the screen. So thank you everybody for providing your response. And we touched on this at the very end of our morning session and talking about in respect to data governance and sovereignty, and what has COVID-19 shown us in respect to the weaknesses and gaps in our data governance and sovereignty in our Indigenous communities. And today, as we move forward with the panelists we brought together of community practitioners, them sharing their reflections with us on COVID-19, the climate crisis, and providing their knowledge and experience to us. So now we will move on into the panel questions. And of the panelists, I will ask them the same question of what we just asked you. So to the panelists, what has COVID-19 made apparent as related to the climate crisis? And we will just popcorn, so whoever feels the urge to speak.
I can go first. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Phoebe Swina. I'll just really quick introduce myself in my native language. Dosi gochinaksik dinhanasata geshbiats. So thank you to everybody. Appreciate your time during this webinar, this summit. For me, that's kind of a big question, and it's something I've been thinking about since March. But for me, I go back to my core values and my core perspectives as a Indigenous mother, Indigenous daughter, and woman at the Pueblo woman. but on my while that said, I also have my formal education, and looking at the big picture, seeing for me with the COVID pandemic and the crisis, it's one of those indications that we have in our environment where we have an imbalance. It's the proverbial canary in the coal mine, where we see a dramatic event or something telling us our environment, Mother Earth, Mother Nature, our environment saying something is not in balance. To have this major event, a major situation that is affecting every single, potentially every single human life on this earth. It goes back to those core values. What's our responsibility in fostering the balance in the world, in the universe as a whole, and what are we doing or not doing to address that balance or imbalance? And so for me, it made apparent, and when we talk about our communities, I saw a number of those words coming up: the vulnerability, the resiliency, the ability for us as Indigenous people to, as we've adapted because of modernization, our resiliency has been impacted in this landscape, in the landscapes or in the environments of our villages, of our Indigenous areas. And so it kind of touches upon all that. And then also looking back to what are the needs versus wants. And when we shift so far to maybe not focusing our priorities on our needs, what do I need as a kukitime, as a kochiri person? What are those needs? And it's as we are endowed with the responsibility, the sacred trust and responsibility to take care of in this time that we are here physically on this earth, to steward and take care of our environment and our people for our kids and those generations yet to be born. What is our responsibility? And so in this COVID pandemic, where I'm seeing all of those different aspects coming to the top of trying to figure out how we navigate as Indigenous people within this new landscape. So I think I'll just end there. I could keep talking, but I want to give my colleagues the opportunity to also address it. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and go next. Nakwang tawa na sa pa na napamanayan hopi matiwa na islongwa na mongtanga sino itana na bawangwa. Hello, everybody. I want to first thank Franklin and Phoebe for joining me on this panel. It's really good to be here with and sharing this space with you and all the participants who are giving us their time this afternoon. I'm presenting from the Hopi lands, Hopi Titsqua, here in Northern Arizona. As Stephanie stated earlier, I'm a postdoc with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Health Research out of the University of Arizona. And so a lot of my work, as you heard in the introduction, really deals with looking at the engineering controls, engineering parameters, engineering designs for meal tailings waste in the Southwest. And as you know, some of you know that a lot of these sites, abandoned and remediated, are located over 60% on Indigenous lands. And so as I was doing a lot of this research, what I often found missing in this story of telling the science was was the story actually coming from the native peoples in which these sites were located. And you can hear the stories of more of the larger populations like the Navajo Nation and the impacts from abandoned mine waste, but you didn't hear this, you don't really see too much of information out there in regards to the impacts to tribes like my tribe, the Hopi tribe, and the exposure related issues that local people are wondering about, considering the health disparities here. And so, I just want to piggyback off of what Phoebe had just mentioned earlier, is just, how all of these impacts that we've already and challenges that we've been dealing with mining, destruction and extraction in our communities, how it's really magnified this need for water security. It's highlighted the need for water specifically, and you saw that in our previous word cloud was, and I think that's the issue that we're having in the Hopi villages here is our water security, but also cultural normalcy. And what is cultural normalcy anyway, defined by the tribe, but defined by our villages? What is cultural normalcy? Has this COVID-19 virus really brought about that need for us to reflect on really what is cultural normalcy in our villages? And how did we maybe shift away from that, or we need to go back and rebalance ourselves to a cultural normacy and redefine what that is for our villages? Because so a lot of our cultural ceremonies have obviously been impacted. We haven't been holding some of our cultural events like usual. And they've been done in more of the small settings where only the village chiefs maybe hold these ceremonies within their small group to take over one certain part of that ceremony and not necessarily make it a communal event. And so we've had to make alterations that way. But I'll just share with you really quickly here. The Hopi Reservation is located here in the northwest. And so it's also really impacted our agricultural practices here. And I can give my mom credit, the one for paying attention to what was happening outside in the outside world, where, we're seeing these changes in climate conditions across the Southwest. I mean, the obvious, we could state the fires that we've seen across the Western United States, these cold fronts moving through, and both of those have had impacts locally here in our community, in which when this cold front came through in September 8th, I think Colorado saw a drastic change in a matter of a day or hours, between 100 degrees and a snowfall event. And my mom was paying attention to the weather. And, we have our farmland down there. And she was really concerned about how this cold front was going to impact our corn and our beans specifically, because they were still fresh beans. And she said, I do not want this freeze cycle to freeze our beans. And so we went down there to the field and gathered what fresh beans we could gather before the freeze came through. And as we were peeling them later that evening, you could tell that there were already impacts to our seeds. As you can see, the smaller one that didn't quite mature fully, that's what the cold weather impacts were to that seed. And if we probably waited overnight, more of those beans would have suffered that impact. So, and locally, our harvesting traditions really involve communal practices with your family, we've had to limit those traditions to just within one family unit. So it's not like a local family harvesting event that we participate in. Now we're doing it within our individual families. So there's various impacts both culturally and governance wise, which I'll touch on a little bit later, um, to the Hopi villages. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Yeah, she 20 in Slobit and he passes chains, the slane that she shane the shanad. I don't know, shy, yeah, but guns, nas, while you don't know, shy, yes. Thank you, everybody, for participating and joining us on this conversation. And I appreciate the Native Institute for inviting me on this panel. So going back to the question, what has COVID-19 made apparent as related to the climate crisis? I think in a way that nature has been telling us that there is something coming. Nature has been informing the people, because I'm more speaking more from the Navajo perspective. So I think things have been changing, climate has been changing, temperature has been changing. And for so many years now, we have been living with a lot of extractions of resources on the reservations. And now it's more apparent over on the eastern side of the Navajo Nation called the Checkerboard area, around Chaco Canyon area, where fracking has become a way of practicing among the corporation, and the people that live around there have been very effective, from air to nature to animals and etc. So I think nature in a way has been trying to tell us that there's this climate crisis and there's something unusual is going to happen. Well, a good example would be over in Australia when that big fire came on, right? Where you see some of the animals just burning up and land just burning up, forest, trees, grasses, and everything you can see. It just started burning up, and just they couldn't control it until finally it got control. And at that time, it was telling us something. So one of the thing also did was that it really revealed that while our time on this earth, we have become very dependent on the Western way of life. Western things. Western thing is meaning non-traditional to your tribe, especially with water, resource to water, access to water, having running water, those kinds of things, and also to air. For the infrastructure, as far as water goes, it really revealed that people that live in the rural area, they really don't have access like I do here, living in Saley with running water and electricity. Back to someone living in the rural area, it become very limited because of social distancing and because of the virus can be transmitted airborne too. So that's how it affected our air. So, and in that way, so it's very important because without air, we can't breathe, so therefore there's no life. And if you go back to the Navajo traditional story, the Navajos on in this audience, if you know the traditional story, how first man and first woman were made, you know, it gave them life. The air came into the two beings, and then that's how they started breathing. That's how we have air. If you look at all other beings, when they don't live no more, when there's no more life in them, there's no more air going through them to keep them alive, right? So in a way that has been affected from crisis that could come from extraction, resources, not taking care of the land, the earth, and the environment. And according to our traditional stories, from the holy people, that the Holy People's instruction to the Navajo people was part of the instruction was to be the caretaker of the land, which as time passed and generation came, and some further along the way, being the caretaker of the land has been forgotten because the Western paradigm, Western way of seeing things, Western way of life, Western way of just existing has taken over. No matter if you live on the reservation or not, we're still somehow associated with that. Balagana catcher, Balagana Han, Neon Yao, Nihizadon, Seki, Stone, Hinaga, then Toyota, Yod, Ebinatna, Yodi, that's Joy the boarding school at Nini, 8 star. A con the Ekbahashi J. Altra. Joy hot out, she the climate crisis he at see. So that way, it's in a way, it affected in many fabric of society. It didn't really affect one part, and it made it really clear to us that globally, if you look at the there was a photo on Facebook where someone took a picture of a Los Angeles before COVID shelter in place thing. And after a few weeks, you could clearly see the difference. And I was talking to my colleague, Travis Teller and Michael Parrish about here on the reservation when shelter in place happened, right? There's a summit about, I would say about 13 miles from here. It's called Buffalo Pass. Right as you go on that summit, if you look towards the north, towards Shiprock, Cortez, and Durango, you could actually see the mountains, Cortez Mountain. You could see Shiprock very clearly, and you could see Mount Hesperus by Durango, clear as day. Now, if you're coming from Albuquerque, that Highway 550, if you are right by Tzatlaotisi and looking towards north, you can see all the mountains in Colorado clearly. So to me, that was actually a clear indication that this COVID actually, one, it really revealed the climate crisis with the environment, with the air pollutions and etc. But it also did one thing. I think it helped the humans realize that we are really contributing to this climate crisis. Also helped the Mother Earth to actually stop taking abuse for a couple of months or a couple of weeks. Now we're back to our normal things again, right? Driving our cars, polluting, and etc. Now the Mother Earth is back to getting hurt again, being abused again. Fracking has happened again, and those kind of extraction can start it again. So in a way, it really, COVID-19 just really helped us realize our environment. I think most people helped them realize that going back, just like Dr. Joseph was saying, going back to this cultural, traditional way of life, traditional way of being, traditional way of thinking, because in this time and during this pandemic, right, Western medicine wasn't superior. Western medicine wasn't superior because when an individual with the symptoms went to the hospital or to the clinic to get help, they were just sent home to quarantine. So that says a lot. On the Navajo Nation, I think some of those people, once they were told there's no cure, there's no magic pill, there's no magic shot, and instead of going home to quarantine, they went back to the medicine man, the knowledge keepers, the healers, the herbalists. So in a way, it also brought back a lot of traditional way of life and traditional way of seeing. It became more prudent now. So I think my team, the Net Policy Institute, we wrote an article in a Travel College Journal it was supposed to be about government, but then the medicine portion came more, the focus became on that. So I think in a way, it did both things. It really revealed a lot of crises that we normally don't see and normally take it for granted in our environment. And it also helped slow down a lot of abuse to the Mother Earth and to our environment. And then because some of the climate change and climate crisis has been happening, like one of my colleagues, Michael and both of my colleagues, Michael and Travis, were saying like 11 years ago here at Saley, that it would rain every day from June, July, and August. That was 11 years ago. And then the snow would stay on the ground from November till March. Now we don't see that. And then some of the things they also noticed was also because of the very high temperature during the day and the very cold temperature in the night, that the difference between the temperature drops between daytime and nighttime, it turned the juniper blue because of that temperature change. So those are indication that our climate is changing, but we take it for granted. We don't notice it because I think a lot has to do with that we're not being vigilant of our nature. We're not being vigilant of what's going on in the nature. What are the birds? How come there's less birds today than it was few years ago, right? I mean, I think climate change just helped us open our eyes. Hopefully it did. Open our eyes mentally, spiritually, and those kinds of things. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Dr. Sage. Did we have any questions or comments? We have time for one or two before moving on to the next question.
Althea, I had a quick follow-up to my colleagues' discussion. As they were talking, I wanted to just add, to what Franklin was saying is, with this current situation we're in, and any situation that we come across as Indigenous people since time immemorial, we've all been tested. You know, us as Indigenous people, we're here because our ancestors were tested. They had to survive. They had to figure out how to continue our migration paths or continue our ways of life. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And I just wanted to share one additional aspect is one of my traditional leaders a couple of decades ago was telling me, as Pueblo people, this is again paraphrasing in English, as Pueblo people, it was not meant for us to live an quote unquote easy life. I don't know how to frame it any other way in English, but to live an easy life. We were meant to be farmers. We were meant to have this balance and carry on our traditional responsibilities on an individual level as well as a community level, in order to maintain that balance. But also, he said, not to take anything for granted. Once we, as our Pueblo at Cochiti, start taking things for granted, that's a really slippery slope. And again, I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say that those words, and it was all in Karis. But the way I took it is, when we forget and we take things for granted, meaning it becomes easier. So back to like fossil fuels, when we heat our homes, do we push the button, or do we go and have to do the work to go to the mountains, get the wood, carry it back? And that effort to do that, to heat our homes or for cooking, makes us realize that we don't take for granted that piece of wood that we spend hours, sweat equity, investing in. But as Franklin and Kerry were saying, this crisis can also be one of these points of in our time frame, in our time here on Earth, when in the future are those yet to be born, those generations to come are going to say, look at what our grandfathers, our grandmas went through. And so this is a time where our responsibility here today is to take care of Mother Earth. It's a wake-up call. It's like the frog that gets thrown in the hot water, all of a sudden like snaps and says, oh man, we're in hot water, versus the frog in cold water getting slowly heated up. I think it's Mother Nature telling us and making apparent to us that, like, come on, everybody, I'm trying to show you what's going on. The thousands of birds that died in New Mexico and in the Southwest over the last few months. The proverbial, again, canary in the coal mine. So, but it's an opportunity as well for us, as Franklin was just mentioning, to then reassess what is important, what is our responsibility, what is our place in this time, in our environment, and again, reevaluating what we do on an individual level as well as a community level. So I just wanted to add that up. So thank you to my colleagues for making me think those thoughts again. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. So I'm going to move on to the second question that we have. So that is, what tribal and other institutional research and data governance strategies, challenges, and examples have emerged? And just to kind of reflect on a conversation we had yesterday with the panelists, you know, the information that you have access to in respect to COVID-19, you know, death rates, recovery rates, and stigmas. So, and that was Kerry who we were talking to about. So Kerry, you want to start?
All right, so in terms of just working with the center, I'll quickly touch upon that and how that's, because I feel like I'm wearing two hats now that I'm back home. You know, as a postdoc researcher trying to gather this information and exposure, metal exposure data for the Hopi tribe, and how that's kind of related to uranium mining exposures locally. And so that's institutionally, that's what we were working on. We had gathered all this information where we assessed biological markers and environmental samples in almost 70 homes across the Hopi reservation to get this individual data back to them. So we were in that midst of distribution. And so what happened in regards to that, of course, we couldn't distribute that information into the households because of COVID. And so we had to alter how we distribute it via phone calls to explain these results to them using pictographic information and actually supplying data, actual numbers that they had. So that was a real challenge for us in terms of the institution I was working with, as well as supplying information to the community in terms of uranium mining forums. And we were supposed to gather survey data on clarifying what those perceptions to mining was in the Hopi community. And of course, that is postponed. I couldn't hold those forums, but just like everybody else here in this meeting, you know, it led to a lot of shifting of priorities. And I think that's what we all had to do in regards to how are we going to protect our communities, our vulnerable populations from coming into our communities. And I think our initial efforts locally on the ground was, you know, how are we going to get supplies to our elders, especially because of, you know, because they're the vulnerable demographic. How are we going to get food supplies, sanitary supplies? And I think initially that's what we were all running around trying to do in our own siloed, I guess, groups for each of our villages. And it seemed like our villages were operating in our own silos, although we're from the one big Hopi community. And that's kind of shifted now to be more inclusive, or, you know, villages are working together now, but initially we were working in those silos. The other issue that we had was we had our first elder pass away from COVID, and we couldn't verify that through the hospitals, but we knew locally through word of mouth. We had our first elder death in May, and that really, I think, resonated through our community because it just happened so quickly. A week prior to that, I actually saw her in our community when we were doing a distribution for supplies. She was actually there to pick up supplies, and I just couldn't believe how fast this took our elder, you know, and that's a lot of knowledge for our community that we lost. And so that led to this discrepancy of information that our villages were provided with in terms of, you know, how can we access information to understand where we fall within these case counts, so that we're able to protect our community, and so we can advocate for ourselves within our villages. And we weren't able to verify any information at all. And so those initial local efforts also led to facilitating those data sharing agreements that we had discussed in the morning session. It was touched upon, you know, how we need to start forming these data sharing agreements so that this information from these regional hospitals are communicated to the direct entities in which the village community level, where we can advocate for ourselves and protect ourselves and do that. And so initially we had to advocate for or facilitate communication between the tribe and the hospital to create these data sharing agreements, because we weren't getting data for a long time, maybe a little over a month. And we didn't know who was impacted or what our village numbers were. And so that initially was our concern. But now what the concern is that we're getting this data of case counts, and they're cumulative case counts. Hopi tribe sits about 320 cases now as a tribe here on the reservation. But the issue that we're having with this data now is that they're cumulative case counts, and they separate them by villages. And so all 11 villages, as well as small towns on the outskirts of Hopi, they're separated that way. And when you look at those numbers, there's maybe a couple villages that are over 100. And then there's maybe 2 that are just under 10. And the issue with that's creating within our community is there's I guess there's this stigma that is being created within the community of knowing that these numbers are higher in certain villages. You know, people having discussions amongst themselves saying, you know, don't go to that village because they have a lot of cases there. Or something like, you know, just warning each other. So it's creating this stigma, and then people from the actual villages are like, you know, what is this? Why isn't the data being reported in a way that can give me information on active cases or recovery data to make it more accurate? Because when they're reporting this information as cumulative totals, it makes me feel like is it to scare our community? Is it to disinform our community? Data is supposed to be there to inform the community and to empower our communities, but it's doing the opposite, and it's creating this psychological, psychosocial, mental, impacts also within the community, because they feel like they distrust the data that's being shared. So, so that anxiety that is being created just from these numbers, I think we need to start looking at them a little bit closer and figure out how we can use it to empower us, rather than just releasing them as just simple cumulative totals. And they're going to keep being reported, but it's just not in a way, or being released in a fashion that leads to more empowerment or more informative decision making from the village level. So those are some of the issues that we're having here in terms of data and data sharing. But I don't know what other, I don't know, Phoebe and Franklin, maybe you guys can talk about some of the issues you're having with your data there.
Thank you, Kerry.
I don't know, Franklin, do you want to go, or you want me to go?
Go ahead and go.
Okay, all right. So one of the difficulties that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this session, that I'm also serving on our state governor, Governor Lujan Grisham's Economic Recovery Council, as the state tries to navigate the COVID pandemic here in the state. And so I've been working very closely with Governor Grisham directly, her staff, as well as the cabinet secretaries here in New Mexico. And here in New Mexico, we have the Indian Affairs Department that is actually at a department level, where there's a cabinet secretary, and Secretary Lynn Trujillo. I've been working very closely with her, particularly on this issue of data and trying to navigate this federal and state just landmines of how we deal with data here in New Mexico. And early on, one of my communities that I'm from, San Felipe Pueblo, we were hit hard with the most extreme impacts and effects of COVID-19 within our tribal communities. And since it was so early on, at the end of basically in April, right before our annual feast day, which is on May 1st, it was that last week in April where San Felipe started to get the first COVID increases. And unfortunately, what had happened is the spreader event was actually a traditional event for individual that was a traditional leader in our pueblo. And so it broke my heart, one, that the COVID cases being tracked to that event for what that event was for. But one of the difficulties that we had early on is we didn't know what we didn't know about COVID. And even, the whole world, we didn't know what we didn't know. There was so much unknown and uncertainty early on. So I know early on, as I worked with the Department of the Indian Affairs Department, the governor's office, as well as the All Pueblo Council of Governors, how do we get this information out to our tribal communities when we don't know a lot and we are uncertain about a lot? I mean, even early on, the messaging about face masks, it was like, do they work? Do they not work? And then it was getting that message to our community members, because as humans, we are part of the vector, the carriers of COVID-19. We are the mode of transport for COVID-19 to move around within our communities. But again, we also have this traditional perspective as well, as we don't talk about negative stuff, because then if we focus on negative stuff, or we talk about it or give life or breath to that, then oh, you know, I don't want to be the one to talk about negative stuff, because everybody's going to say, oh, well, Phoebe said, and then it'll be tagged on me of bringing that negativity to the pueblos or a community. So there was a lot of early on, how do we navigate this? And then back to the data. Whose data is it? How do we report it? How do we get the information to the community? Is it accurate data? Because early on in some of our pueblos here, we did have folks pass away, but was it COVID related? Or was it, oh, because they have diabetes, or they have a heart condition, or they have, you know, cirrhosis, or another different type of underlying medical condition? And so, unfortunately, I've had my cousins, I call them my brothers, pass away. I have a couple that passed away in this time, and it's hard. It was hard for me to even explain to my own family, which they trust. We have a level of trust, but it also got to a very kind of point of conflict of trying to educate and trying to share the information of what, as we got to know about what exactly, how it travels. Like, for example, is it in the air? How long does it, how long is it active on the surface? All of those little nuances that are helpful to understand how on an individual level we can mitigate the disease or the virus. And then because we have, as Pueblo people, and I go in between 3 different Pueblos, San Felipe, Santo Domingo, and Cochiti. My kids are half Santo Domingo, and all 3 are we have planting, we have feasts, we have all these activities. And I sure heck didn't want to be the one to say, oh, well, don't do it, because that's not one, as a female, that's not my place. But then also knowing the information, and then the state trying to share that information with the governors and the tribal leadership in New Mexico. And I think it was around early May. I got to a point where when I was identified to help Governor Grisham on her COVID council group, people said, well, why is it you? and because we have this whole governance thing with identifying and respecting tribal sovereignty here in New Mexico. So it was, as a female, as you know, a tribal member, I was in a really awkward situation where I wanted to help kind of explain, but I also knew the difficulties between IHS and the tribes, and some of the lack of information going back and forth, and again, uncertainty, and not knowing what we don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know. So I could sense that from IHS. I knew the state was having difficulty collaborating with IHS as well. So Department of Health, Kerry talked about it, the data sharing agreements. There was challenges or complications in getting that all straight forward. We have, multiple tribes here in New Mexico. So data sharing agreements, and even right now, I'm not even certain everybody has data sharing agreements right now with the state yet, but that's critical. And it was something that we identified critical to support tribal sovereignty, so that each tribe had this data sharing agreement with another government, in this case, the state, but as well as what was IHS's role, the federal government's role. Does the tribe just deal with the feds? But in this case, IHS, again, I'm trying to be respectful. There was complications and difficulties in terms of resources and information flowing both ways. So it got to a point where I know early on, the zip code data was a very hot topic when Governor Grisham finally just said, I'm gonna just release what we have, the information we have, and do it via zip code. So we're not saying it's at San Felipe, or it's at Santo Domingo, or it's at Zia, or it's at Jemez, but zip code. But here in New Mexico, we'll have like San Felipe is the zip code for 87001. So if you're in that zip code, you're in San Felipe. So it was almost like, okay, they are releasing tribal data. And what does that mean? Did the tribe give authorization to do that? But that said, is knowing community members and my own family members from San Felipe, there was a lot of internal, because we're all human. We're all human, and in close-knit communities, it's like that game of telephone. You tell something to one person, by the time it gets through 4 phone calls, it's a different message. And so again, with COVID, you don't want to incite panic, but you want to also share information that will be important for people to then take on, again, the individual responsibility to help mitigate the spread. So early on, it was like, okay, well now a lot of the people at the Pueblo didn't know how many cases, and did so-and-so pass away from COVID? We didn't know. So when that data got released, there was a lot of backlash because then we had the stigma as well. I'm not sure if you heard in the papers, but here in New Mexico, we had certain hospitals that actually separated the mother and baby because they came from one of these communities without permission from the mother or the family. Because they said, oh, well, they're from this community, we're going to assume they're COVID positive. So there was a little, that unfortunately happened here in New Mexico. So it's like, how do we use the data? But then we also need data to be shared both ways, because, and I shared this with the All Pueblo Council of Governors during one of my presentations, because I finally just, I bucked up and I said, okay, I'm gonna put my head in this noose here. I'm gonna be ready to take all the punches. And I went to the governors and really want to engage them and say, I'm here to help. I may not be the perfect one. I'm not a male. I'm a female. I'm not a tribal leader. I will never be, because my communities are traditional appointments and they're all male leadership. I'm not a spokesperson, but I have this certain set of expertise and skills. So I'm gonna throw myself out there. And I just went to all the governors during the meeting and I said, I know I'm not the perfect one, but I'm here to help and I will do my best. I can't say everything is gonna be hunky-dory and everything's gonna go smooth. We are going to have problems. We're going to have obstacles. We're going to have points of conflict, but I'm willing to work through those. And after I kind of ripped that Band-Aid off, then they weren't happy that the governor didn't consult with them to see who they wanted. But I said, I'm here, and right or wrong, best or not, worst pick in the world. And just really have a sense of humility and humbleness that, that I'm just here to serve and help out. But in that whole discussion, I went through the data that we did have as of May. And I remember on the call, I showed the data from the 1918 flu epidemic that hit the area. I showed data from the swine flu. And you'll see like these multiple waves or surges or spikes, whatever you want to identify or label it. And I said, and based upon the epidemiologists, based upon the scientists, based upon those medical experts, we may see these multiple waves in this virus. And I remember getting on the call and the governors were just silent. And they said, wait, I thought we were done. especially for those communities that had the initial surges. They said, wait, you're telling me it's not going to end at the end of this month? And this was in May. I said, unfortunately, it's not going to end. They said, we thought we were out of the woods. And so to me, it goes back to that education piece. We need all of us, all of the Indigenous professionals that come from a very core traditional perspectives and have our ties to our communities to help translate the data so we can have our community leaders also understand what the data means, what it looks like, and how then they can use it to make the decisions they need to do to take care of the people, to make the decisions that they need to do to have governance, but as well as to understand what it means to release data. Back to what Dr. Joseph was saying is, could that data then be misused as the hospital misused it to say, oh, I'm going to separate this mother and baby, or whoever comes from that community, I don't want them coming in my store. So there's this again point of contention where we have to be very careful about the data, that data sovereignty, right, of what information is shared as well, and how it can be utilized by those that in a negative or even a positive way in terms of being able to fully explain what the data means. And so through this whole thing, I think I've been really trying to balance that in working with our tribal communities here in New Mexico, and in particular, many of the pueblos that I'm working with to try to navigate that. And every day is a new day, and every day there's new twists to how, like, what worked today or what worked last week may not work today, just because for whatever reason, and it's ever evolving. But I think as long as we do our best, as well as with that heart, with the heart and the goodness to try to help, knowing that we may make mistakes. Like me, I'm not the perfect one. I'm not, but I'm here to help. So, but as well as helping our leaderships make those good decisions and understanding the information that we do have. And unfortunately here in New Mexico, I'm getting ready to do another update to some of our tribal leaderships. And I'm really struggling, I'm really super struggling, is how do you show the data and frame it so that, again, I don't feel like I'm like, okay, this is Phoebe talking negative, and when things go wrong, it's going to be her fault because of our traditional perspectives of the negativity. But I want to show one thing since we're on this really quick. I pulled up some data. This came from yesterday. And this is data from the Department of Health. So if you look at this data, this is a graph of the AN is American Indian or Alaska Native, and then, you know, the Asian population, the African American, Hispanic, and white. And what jumps out to you? And so why do we have to be mindful and careful within our communities? There's a whole bunch of, you know, we could spend probably a whole week debating why the Native Indigenous bar is 10 times that of the Hispanic bar, which is the next highest. But this, to me, when I've shared this with some of our tribal leaders and our governors, it's like, okay, we do have to be mindful. We have to use this in a way so that we do have to know we have the data, that we have to be careful. And nobody likes to talk about death, especially in our communities, in our Indigenous communities. But this is the data that the Department of Health has right now. And it's really, you know, you almost don't have to even speak to it. You just see it and it's obvious that we need to be mindful and careful. So I just wanted to share that with everybody, just from on the ground perspective of what we're dealing here in New Mexico with. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Franklin, did you have anything to add to the second question? And you're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me? So I think one of the things that the Navajo Nation actually did a pretty good job is actually having access of the COVID-19 as far as positive and recovery and the death rate. I think at the beginning it was a struggle for them because we really didn't have a command center. It went to emergency management where they dealt with natural disasters, heavy snowfall, snow removal, and those kinds of things. But they were given the task of this, but they really didn't know what to do, right? So that's when there was I think for a while they really were combobulated with all this information, didn't know what to do, what it is. So finally, I think the command center started to get to some of these data, and they were able to release it. And it was pretty much like a work in progress kind of deal because the pandemic was actually new. The virus is new to the nation, to the country, to the world, to the global world. So they really didn't know how to manage it and what. And I think a lot has to do with the privacy issue too, because at one point I think we had a conversation. We, as in the Net Policy Institute, had a conversation. And why can't they release who's affected, who, you know, those kind of things, so we can take more precautions and etc. So at that point, I think they did a pretty good job. As far to this day, it looks pretty good because it took this long for them to get it right. Also, I think one thing for the tribal challenges of any institution is that it just shut down the tribal government. Shelter in place did, curfew shut down the government. Any research being done on the reservation just got shut down because for the Net Policy Institute, the way we collected our data and do our research is through, we went where people went. It was more convenient sampling. So we went to the flea market, chapter houses where the Navajos convene and come together. And so that limited a lot of things. As far as the tribal government goes, it really, the challenge was it just got shut down once the people that work at the chapter house in the 110 communities, they went on administrative leave. So they really didn't know what administrative leave meant. So they just locked up the doors and went home and never came back. So that way the chapter house, historically, chapter house were pretty much the hub of wherever everybody went to go get help. But with this pandemic, it just shut it down, and nowhere, people couldn't go anywhere and stuff like that. So in order to get more data, research need to be done, right? Even during the pandemic. So one of the things we started doing back at the beginning of the pandemic is actually talking about how can the Net Policy Institute go look at this pandemic, COVID-19, and just look at shelters, how did they impact? So we started looking at the question, how does COVID-19 impact Navajo Nation, particularly to the cultural way of life, political institutions, social structure, and education? It's pretty much looking at this question from a sociological perspective. And also we're gonna include some of the traditional way of like cultural and those kinds of things in this study. So based on that, and that's why currently we're actually doing a study during the pandemic. And it's kind of challenging in a way because we don't do paper copies no more. It's online. It's harder to do online surveys on a reservation where you have limited access to internet. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Franklin. So the last question that we have for the panelists, so if you all could provide your reflection on the question, and then we'll go into questions from the audience. So the last question is, how can we center Indigenous governance and cultural lifeways as we go through a time of crisis or crises?
I'll go ahead and answer this really quickly since I'm already on unmute. So I was listening to this song, the Kachina spirits come to visit us every summer to help bring rain into our communities in this arid region where a lot of our 80% practices dry farming techniques solely reliant on rain. And so I was listening to this song last night, and it brought back, I guess the foundational piece as to this question that you asked on, how can Indigenous governance and how can we center Indigenous governance and lifeways as we go through this transition? That song talked about, Hopis and asking why are Hopis forgetting the old way of life and the good way of life, and what Hopi is about. And in that song, it helps you reflect on kind of where we are now and where we were before, and recentering ourselves to what some of those cultural values are. And I think when we talk about climate change and in times of the pandemic, I think we really need to center this discussion or always include that it's a human-induced climate change, and that when we put that human-induced climate change in that term, climate change, that's really what it is reflecting on us as a society, on how these relational responsibilities that we have to each other in society, and kind of how the respectful relationships has almost been forgotten. And we need to recenter those value systems, those core values in a lot of these systems in which we operate. And that's just basic respecting all life. You're working hard, you're waking up early to greet the morning sun, you're humble, you're practicing reciprocity, called traditional reciprocity, that's built in all of our relationships here, our clanship responsibilities to each other, and understanding those clan responsibilities and teachings that you have. And Hopi is here, just like Phoebe mentioned, we're here to be stewards of the land. And how do you do that in a way where we have this modern system of influence here, in which it's helpful being able to extract the important pieces of that to advance our societies in which we operate today, but understanding that we have to decolonize these systems, and that we accepted because we didn't really know how to incorporate this colonial system in our way of governance. And so I think that starts with here in Hopi. What they're doing now is those core values that I discussed. It's really unfortunate, but with this pandemic response, I haven't really seen, and I don't know if Phoebe and Franklin can kind of touch up on that and what they see in terms of representation, but we don't have much representation of youth and young adults in these discussions at the governance level in Hopi. I've tried to get some involved, although they're very represented in terms of village duties and cultural representation, and these traditional things that we do in our villages, and those responsibilities that they have, and raising corn and doing what we're supposed to do as stewards of the land, being farmers. we're present there, but there's not much representation or contribution of the youth voice at that level in terms of governance. And so I think we really need to understand, how are we suppressing that voice, or how can we welcome that voice? Because right now we're making decisions on the behalf of their futures. And shouldn't they also be involved in those discussions that impact their future? Right now, the Hopi tribe is, Franklin mentioned, not having access to reliable internet, or these surveys, doing surveys, having difficulty with doing these surveys over the internet. Right now, the Hopi tribe is pursuing legal discussion in the court of Arizona for our water rights. And it's all done through webinar. And the state of Arizona wanted to continue these discussions and keep the court dates to quantify our water rights over a web platform, which is the first ever in history in which water rights are being discussed and court litigation is happening over the internet in this way. But Hopi opposed it initially to postpone it until we kind of had a all clear for COVID, but they rejected that request, the state of Arizona. And so right now, we question the fairness of these discussions that are going to be a huge factor in our water security for the future, because they're quantifying our water rights in the courts right now. And so there's just all these things that we can say are continuous injustices that we're facing, but at the same time, there's also good things happening on the ground here, in which others are holding these sessions to really get that youth voice involved, to understand what their perceptions are in terms of COVID-19 and how has this impacted the youth, and what can we do as the people at the decision-making table are contributing to those decision makers roles here at the tribe. We just need to give them more space. And I feel like that's a part of kind of decolonizing the system that we have right now. So, and right now the Hopi tribe is actually also involved in this Hopi transition. They have a Hopi transition team in which they're taking on a huge role to decolonizing the system. So basically, Hopi tribe will now be in jurisdiction of their education system K through 12, rather than it being under BIA or BIE jurisdiction. And I think that's a really good start into having these conversations or in influencing the curriculum to really incorporate these indigenous knowledge systems, these core values, and these knowledge systems that we've had for thousands and thousands of years. As Andrew had mentioned, that we've always been data keepers. This morning, we've always been data experts. And so really empowering your community to, how do you start decolonizing these systems? And that's just one way that it's happening locally here.
Thank you, Kerry. Phoebe or Franklin?
I'll go. I think the magic word here is decolonization. Why do I say that? Well, the current government we have, especially on the Navajo Nation, it is pretty much foreign to the Navajo traditional people. And that's why I think it is very difficult and challenging to implement the net fundamental law. Because the net fundamental law in the current government, it really doesn't overlap or doesn't cross or doesn't even come together. So one of the things is really, if we really want to transition during this pandemic, I think this is the perfect time to actually go into alternative governments. So one of those ways how we can do is I think this is the time also to restructure and refocus and actually implement it, the Navajo fundamental law into governance. And it has happened with the tribal courts, but as far as governance and how to governance, it has not happened. And there has been actually, there's a motorcycle guy driving by. So anyway, it has happened because back in July, we actually wrote an article about governments from the historical perspective. And back then, the Navajo people really did not have, as far as the head chief or someone in position, they call them Nachita. The one who points, that's what it means, Nachita. So that's how they used to talk back then, these leaders, and they would say, and that's how, I mean, I think for a lot of people it's called sign language, but it wasn't sign language, it was just them pointing and talking and stuff like that. To this day, they still have people like that. They were actually the leaders, and actually they came together and strategized about certain things, just like the government does. And then from there, but then most of them were medicine men, and that's how a lot of people equate medicine men as leaders. But traditionally, that's how it went. And then when the Europeans came, they implemented this. Well, actually, when they wanted to extract the resources, that's when tribal government came to be. It's more became a westernized way of governance. So to really, really transition into what is truly indigenous governments, first, I think we have to go back and see how land policy and restructure that. Because right now, the Navajo Nation reservation is still a trust land. It's the government still has it. So we need to, unstructure that and actually come up with a new indigenous land management plan and have all these traditional thinkers come and put their input in it. I think that's what needs to happen in order for us for this, because right now, if we look at it, the pandemic just pretty much shut down our government. So the Western government too. Well, I think they tried to redo it, but on the reservation, and it's modeled off the U.S. government, and also it really just shut it down. So it's not working. So now we try a new thing in which we're actually majority of an indigenous way of being a leader, indigenous way of planning. Those things need to be implemented. At this might be a good time to do it. So, and then that's where I think the youth could come in too, because, and the Lakota leaders, they always talk about, when they become a leader, they put in the leadership position, they think 7 years, they think and plan 7 generations ahead. So I think that really makes it perfect. I mean, it makes sense. And then I think that's why I think youth could be really important, because right now, most of the participant in tribal voting and in leadership position are pretty much later adults and elders. So the youth, they might come here and there, but and right now, I don't know how old our youngest tribal delegate is, council delegate, probably in their 30s. So I think we need to get more youth involved, and this would be a perfect time to do it. That's it.
Thank you. Franklin, Phoebe, you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Are we trying to hit 4 o'clock just so I can, or 5 o'clock or whatever time it is here?
3 o'clock Pacific. So we have about 3 minutes.
Okay. So just to kind of wrap it up, going back to the question, how do we center our indigenous governance and cultural lifeways? And the 2 doctors before me, said it well as well. Back to our youth, and that engagement on all levels is really important. In our Pueblo way, we are taught that, you know, the youth, that the babies and the children, that they are of a special spirit, and to respect that. And I think because of, you know, colonization and this impact from the modern or Western societies have shifted that. And so for many years, that's another imbalance, is how we maybe thought, you know, didn't engage our youth, or maybe didn't have the respect for our youth as well. So these points of crisis, again, as I was sharing earlier, are points where if we can take a step back, a breather, and realize we got to center ourselves, we got to create that balance, but that engagement. And it is my brother, my cousin, he's always telling, one of his big messages is, we've got to be the change we want to see in the world. And change in a very, again, English world, but it doesn't mean the same as, you know, as he says it, but that, you know, if we pray every morning when the sun comes up, and we expect our kids and our future generations to do that, we've got to do that as well. And when we do it, we bring our kids along. It's not something we just do and then leave the kids in the living room watching the TV. And also and I'm still learning. I'm not fluent in our native language, but the only way to get back to those lessons, and I call it our since time immemorial encyclopedia, is through our native language, through our Keris, our Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, and all those other indigenous communities in this area, to get back to those concepts, core values, and principles, is through the language. And so to kind of wrap it up, I just wanted to share with everybody what I've, again, tried to do, and look at the positiveness of this ongoing crisis that we're going back. But when in our lifetime, when in our careers, or people say, hey, stay at home and be with your kids. don't go to work, stay at home, be with your kids. When have we been told that, you know? And so you know, when people are saying, well, I want to go do this, go travel, go. So I was telling my kids, so what we're going to do, back to that centering, back to getting back to land, is we're going to grow our corn, and we're going to do it all by hand, just hand tools. So we didn't take a tractor. And what does that mean? And then teaching our kids the native language associated to every part of this plant, from when it's a baby, to treat it as a child, to teach our kids like that they also have the responsibility. They plant that seed in the ground. What does that mean? That is their children. And this is a picture, because every day we had a big windstorm come through, and it laid down our corn. One day we came back to the field, we stood them back up, and they were still, you know, kind of hurting. So my boyfriend, my partner in my life, he was telling our kids that we'll sing to them, talk to them, and love them. So in their mind, my kids are saying love them. So they were hugging each plant, each corn plant, and talking to it, and singing to it. And then to also, back to that, is to again continue that engagement, those core values and principles. So we didn't go to town to get fish bait to go fishing. We went to our field and got the earthworms, gathered them the night before, and then go back in the morning to the China, to the river, and go fishing. And so teaching them those concepts of how everything is interrelated and interdependent, back to the governance. And I chose this time to talk to my son. He's a male, and as I said, in terms of governance, our leaderships are male. And I feel kind of kind of bad in some cases. I put so much on him. He's only 8, just turned 8, and just talking to him that even though he'll be a leader, he still needs his sister. He still needs the women in his life. That everybody is interrelated, that we're interdependent, just like the environment is. Back to those core values, those core principles and concepts of balance. If we want fish, we have to have a good field and good soil so that the earthworms are there so we can have bait to have fish. And what does it mean to take care of that whole fish when we bring it home? We don't just like eat the good parts and then throw it in the trash. It means to take it back to the river and thank the river for giving us the gift of a meal that day. So taking it full circle back to governance is remembering those core values and how those tribal leaders need to think about as they govern our people and make those decisions on behalf of our people. So I just wanted to share that and wrap it up with kind of that concept and those values. So thank you so much. I appreciate all the time and your hearts and ears and minds this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe, Franklin, and Kerry. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. I apologize we didn't have time for questions, but Andrew did put their emails in the chat box if you'd like to follow up with them. We highly encourage you to keep this conversation going in the work that you're doing. But thank you for joining us today. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. We look forward to seeing you again. And it's always great to hear you three speak and spend time with you. So thank you.